in the last session, we sort of did quite a classical approach to the emptiness, the Vipassana practice of emptiness, by directing our attention to the person, the me. Where is this me that seems to be here? Looking in the body and the mind for this me. What I'd like to do now is an alternative approach to Vipassana, one that's often emphasized in the Dzogchen and Mahamudra systems of practice within the Kagyu and Nyingma school of Tibetan Buddhism. So in these systems of practice, there's a lot of emphasis on the mind itself. So when they enter into Vipassana practice, then rather than focusing or looking for the person, they're looking at the mind. So I'd like to do now a short Vipassana practice of looking at the mind. How does the mind exist? So let's do that. 15-minute practice. Keeping the back nice and straight, and at the same time allowing the entire body to become completely relaxed, completely at ease. Allowing the breathing to settle into its natural rhythm. And setting the mind in a state of ease and relaxation. Simply allowing it to come to rest in the present moment. Simply becoming aware of the rhythm of the breath. Then with the eyes at least partially open, resting your gaze in the space in front of you, simply release all appearances, allowing the mind to come to rest. Not doing anything at all. Simply be present, knowing that you're aware. Resting in awareness itself. Does awareness have a location? Don't try to intellectually answer this, just look. Is it inside the body? Is it inside the head? Is awareness outside the body? How big is awareness? Does awareness have a physical limit or boundary? Is there anything outside of awareness? Now release all questioning and just rest, resting in awareness. Any questions or comments?
Do you prepare questions before meditation?
Sorry?
Do you prepare a question before meditation?
You're asking me or if you should do it?
I should.
Okay. So the question is, should we prepare these sorts of questions ahead of meditation? I think in this sort of practice there are many different questions you can ask, and so it's good to receive a number of different instructions so you get a sort of flavour of all the sorts of types of questions that can be asked, and then see which ones sort of resonate with us, that seem to have some sort of impact. And then I would tend to mainly focus on those questions. And then you can have a sort of a standard set of questions to ask. And again, I wouldn't ask too many questions. I mean, you could even in one session just simply ask one question. So here I was just giving a few different options. So, you know, if you get too many questions, you're sort of like this. So I'd rather keep it simple, and you could maybe just ask one question and just rest and look for that. But it's good to have a number of sort of questions available to pick from. Because if you're always doing the same thing, sometimes it gets a little bit, what's the word, mechanical. And you don't really get in the practice. So it's good to mix it up a little bit.
And second question, what I need or what we can need in self-meditation is maybe images or sensations. Do you stop to observe it?
Yeah. So same here again. As with the Shamatha practice of resting in awareness, the object is awareness itself. So in Shamatha, of course, we're just resting in that experience. And here in Vipassana, we are paying close attention to awareness. And based on those questions, we're investigating that awareness. So if other things come up, thoughts and sensations, again, just leave them there. Don't pay any attention to them.
Maybe such image or sensation has a relation to the object of meditation.
It may have a relation, but it isn't awareness. Of course, whenever we have some mental experience, often there's some physical thing going on in the body. But in this practice, we're investigating how does awareness exist. We're not investigating how do thoughts exist or how sensations exist. And so that could be another Vipassana practice, to investigate sensations in the body, to investigate thoughts. So these are all valid objects. But in this particular practice, we're only interested in awareness itself and just focusing on that. Okay?
My question is it better when you practice something like Mahamudra, to have an instructor, just like you did now, to give the instructions to the meditators, or is it better maybe to do it alone with a book, or
Yeah, I mean, of course, it's often said that when we first receive instructions, it's better to receive that from a teacher rather than from a book. But then, of course, and in terms of guided meditations, if they're guided meditations that involve a number of steps, then it can be good to listen to those a number of times to become familiar with the practice. But then I think we also need to let go of that, because again we could get a bit lazy and become a bit mechanical and think we're meditating, where we're just listening, tick, 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 and we're not really doing the practice. We're just sort of half following the instructions or listening to the instructions and not doing much else. So once we've learnt the practice, I think it's good to let go of that and do the practice ourselves. And I think it's good to hear these sorts of instructions from a number of different people, because everyone's got a slightly different way of presenting, and then you can get slightly different perspectives of the practice, so that can also be very helpful. But then also I think it can be useful, of course, after some time to, again, receive the instructions from someone or listen to a guided meditation, because sometimes, you know, after some weeks or months, we sort of, how we do the practice sort of slowly changes, and then somehow we're, you know, doing something that's not really the practice and we don't realise it. And then when we go back and listen or get some more instructions, we go, oh, hang on, I'm supposed to be doing it like this, aren't I? So that can be also helpful.
There's something I don't understand. I understand observing the awareness in order to cultivate stability and clarity. That's good.
Mm-hmm.
What we've done this week. Now, within the Vipassana, I'm trying to see the awareness, to understand
How that awareness exists.
How it exists. I didn't ask myself before, like in the previous meditation, how do I perceive the self? How do I perceive the awareness? It looks like it's a whole new, for me, question that I have to address. What is the object of negation, or identifying the target?
Yeah.
And it's difficult enough with the self. Now, do I want to put some time
No.
to find out how do I perceive the mind?
Yeah. Yeah. So the question is the differences between the approach, I think, between the person and the mind. And actually here in this sort of Mahamudra Dzogchen approach, and I think I remember Alan Wallace was saying this last year, and he's studied a lot of Dzogchen and some Mahamudra, and he says he's never ever seen the term object of negation in Mahamudra or Dzogchen. So we're using a different approach here. So here we're using a very direct approach to question what's in front of us, rather than go through this sort of systematic, methodical approach here. So they're very different approaches. Of course, they're aiming at the same result of coming to realise that either the person or the mind or any phenomena is empty of inherent existence. So this approach here, there's nothing to do with object of negation or anything like that. It's very much a very direct approach. And often with this approach, if people are very intuitive, we don't even really need to ask questions. That we just do the Shamatha practice of resting in awareness, and as our mind becomes more stable and clear, it becomes this sort of how that awareness exists. Intuitively we get a sort of an insight without asking the questions. Because remember, questions here in this practice is actually a little bit of an interruption, because it's like conceptual things. But again, usually for this sort of Vipassana, we need a bit of reminding us, how to do the looking. But if we're very intuitive, we can simply rest in awareness and really just spontaneously come to an insight into the nature of the mind. So that's why this Shamatha practice is very much known as a bridge into Vipassana practice. And I think in one of Padmasambhava's quotes earlier, he said, that this is a Shamatha practice. He said, but you may even identify pristine awareness. And pristine awareness is the nature of the mind. So again, we may not even need to ask these sorts of questions, but often if we're not really sharp or intuitive, we don't realise what we're seeing, what's actually there. So that's why a little bit of questioning can help us to really look more closely.
At the beginning I felt the awareness and then during your question I felt like it's expanding to encompass everything. And then it became, since it encompassed everything, it became like a pool with trees and things reflecting in it. Now my question is, and I was looking at that pool. Now my question is, should I leave this pool or should I look at it? Or
when you say look at the pool or leave it, do you mean there's some sort of actual image of a pool in your mind?
Yeah, a surface of water with everything that has been created, reflected on it?
I wouldn't particularly look at the pool. Maybe what can happen is with your experience, that experience, to try and make sense of it, you thought about that analogy of the pool. That's good, that's okay. But again, I wouldn't then just look at the pool, because then you're not resting in awareness. So again, sometimes these things will spontaneously come to mind as a sort of way of understanding the experience. That's okay, but then I just go, once you've got that, then I just go back to the experience and not focus on that, because then you're just looking at some sort of image, which is not really going to get you any further. Yeah, so I specifically asked these questions for this reason that you actually mentioned, because often we feel as if the mind or awareness is here, and we normally feel like that for two reasons. One is that science often says that's the mind equals the brain, and the brain is definitely here, with that for sure. So when they often in some areas of science, they say that mind equals brain, basically, or function of brain or something. So then we think, okay, the mind is here because the brain is here. And the other reason is that most of our sense faculties are located here, and often, particularly a visual sense, is dominant. So since all the sense faculties are sort of clustered here, we have a sense that the mind is also somewhere here because the sense faculties are here. So that's why, and I think I mentioned this earlier for another question, is what it can be therefore good to meditate in a completely dark room, black room, because then there's not really this, and if you can keep the body very quiet, because if you're moving, then you have a solid sense of body, but if you can keep that very still, so solid sense of body sort of dissipates, and then of course, and hopefully it's quiet, so you're not the sound there, and then the visual is like there's nothing to locate the vision because it's just black. And then it's interesting to see experience in terms of location and stuff. And then, because this sort of sensory thing here really pulls us to feel as